Okay, so this is the graph sinusoidal functions phase shift skill, and this is the single most the skill I get the single most questions on in the class. Again, Khan does not do a terribly good job on the videos of this one, so I want to take you through a few examples. This being the first one. Okay, so we are asked, we're given the graph below, and we're asked to write the sinusoidal function. So, as I was talking about in our little chart here, we're starting at graph, and we're going to try to make our way over to equations. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is kind of identify where my function starts. I know it doesn't really start anywhere. It goes on forever and ever. But for me, I use the first point, the one that's furthest to the left, and make that my starting point. So this 1, 1 is going to be our starting point. And I just plot it in the box here, okay? Since the x-coordinate's 1, right, we'll have a 1 down here. And since the y-coordinate's 1, we'll have 1 right here. Next, I'm going to put the second point on my graph. It's just 1.5 and 1.5 here at the midpoint. So that goes right there. As you can see, 1.5 here, 1.5 there for the x and the y. They just happen to both have the same coordinates here. Okay. From there, I'm going to just start filling in the box. So I know, the amplitude is always the distance between this, like the minimum and the midline, so that's 0.5. That means that this to the maximum also has to be 0.5. So 1.5 plus 0.5 gives me 2. Okay. Now I'll do the similar thing for the other side of the box. Between 1 and 1.5 is 0.5. So I know I've got 4 of these sections, and they're all the same size. So I just keep going over. I go from 1 to 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 to 3. Okay. And now I've got my box filled out. I can start to fill out the middle section. That'll get us to the equation. So the first thing is the equation form, and that's the negative cosine shape. If you're wondering how I know that, go back to the introduction video. It has the different equation forms in it: negative cosine, positive cosine, sine, and negative sine. Okay. And then the amplitude is 0.5, right? We found that early on. The midline is 1.5, right? That's just the midline. So these are the two vertical pieces of information I need. Now we're going on to phase shift and period. That's going to come from the bottom, the horizontal information. Okay. Now the phase shift is 1, and that's because this starts on 1 instead of 0. And it's 1 in the positive direction. Okay. So it's not -1, it's positive 1. And now we're just going to find the period, which is going to be all these things added up. Okay. So it used to be when we always started on 0, whatever this number was the period. But when we start on 1, it's a little different, right? It's really 3 minus 1, or 2. Okay. This is the horizontal distance here is 2. Okay. So now we filled in this stuff, we can start to do our equation. And the first thing, I'm going to put in the equation form. This negative comes from the negative here, and cosine. I'm going to put in the amplitude, which just goes on the outside, and then the midline, the plus 5. Most people are pretty good with that stuff. The harder thing is getting the insides right. Okay, so we're going to go through that. The first thing I'm going to implement is the phase shift. And what's tricky is that even though the phase shift is positive 1, when it goes into the equation, we change the sign. We change the opposite one. So if this had been -1, then we do x plus 1, right? So it always flips. So that's one tricky thing about the phase shift. Okay, now on to the period. And the period's tricky because it's not just like plus or minus 2 goes in here. What we have to do before we put it into the equation is actually take 2 pi and divide it by whatever the period is. Okay, so the number that's in the equation, when it happens to end up being pi here, is not the same as the actual period. It's 2 pi divided by the actual period, or pi. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. Here's the total equation here. If you want to, I think Khan accepts the answer either way. You can distribute this and get pi x minus pi here if you want, but I think it accepts it either way. And note that this parenthesis is important here. Okay, you just can't put the pi by the x. So I hope that helps on this problem.